Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today you've got a story that's so strange. It almost sounds like it's straight out of like a cartoon or something. I mean, we're talking about a man in Tennessee who was accidentally shot by his dog.
Yeah, you really can't make this stuff up.
It's definitely one of those hold on what headlines. So to get to the bottom of this, we've got a news article from IOL and a pretty lively Reddit discussion, of course, from Sherbet Free, because where else? And then a YouTube news segment from WREG News Channel 3 over in Memphis.
Yeah.
And we're going to kind of sit through all this, see what we can uncover, maybe even learn a thing or two about, responsible pet ownership, gun safety, all that good stuff along the way.
Yeah, it's always amazing to me how these kind of bizarre stories can have these really important lessons kind of hidden inside.
Totally. Okay,
Okay.
so let's set the scene.
Right.
We're in Fraser, Tennessee. It's the morning of Monday, March 10th, and 39-year-old Gerald Kirkwood is in bed with a woman. They've got a firearm nearby, and their 1-year-old pit bull Oreo jumps up on the bed with them.
And that is where things take a turn, right? So, according to the reports, Orea's paw somehow gets tangled up in the trigger guard of the firearm, which is, the part that's specifically designed to prevent accidental discharge. So, kind of ironic that it might have actually helped cause it in this case.
Yeah, like a tragic irony, right? So the gun goes off the bullet, graces Kirkwood's leg.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, it's not a serious injury, and he's treated and discharged from Regional 1 Hospital. But here's where the story gets even weirder. The woman leaves the house with the firearm before the police even show up.
That detail definitely raises some questions, right? It adds a whole other layer to this whole thing, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about like how everything happened, all the decisions that led up to this.
Yeah.
So let's jump into that Reddit discussion for a sec, because people had some thoughts, as you might imagine.
Reddit, the land of unfiltered opinions.
Right. And as you can probably guess, some people immediately zeroed in on the fact that Oreo's a pit bull. Those comments that jump to conclusions about pit bulls being dangerous, basically blaming the breed for what happened.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how bias can shape how we see things, right?
Yeah.
While it's true, different breeds have different tendencies, you can't ignore that responsible ownership and training are huge factors for any dog. It's all about individual temperament, early socialization, the whole 9 yards. You can't just slap a label on an entire breed because of a few isolated incidents.
That's so important. It's like we got to look past those gut reactions and think about the specifics of each situation. This whole thing, as crazy as it is, should make us think about how easily we resort to stereotypes, whether it's about dogs or anything else.
For sure. It's a reminder that critical thinking is super important, especially these days when we're just bombarded with info and opinions. Gotta question our assumptions, get different perspectives, and look beyond those easy labels.
Couldn't agree more. Now, that Reddit discussion also brought up something else that's worth talking about: firearm safety.
Hmm.
Because even though this might seem like a total freak accident, it also makes you wonder about responsible gun ownership,
Mm.
you know?
It really does. It brings home the point that you gotta treat every firearm as if it's loaded, and never ever leave them within reach of children or pets. Knowing the rules isn't enough, you have to actually live by them.
And that's what's interesting, because this isn't even the first time something like this has happened. Remember that story back in 2018 with Matt Branch, the guy who got accidentally shot by his dog while they were out hunting?
Oh, yeah. He put his loaded shotgun in the bed of his truck, and his Labrador retriever stepped on it and made it fire. The bullet went through the truck and hit him in the leg, even severed his femoral artery. He was super lucky to even make it.
It's scary to even think about. Two different incidents, years apart, both with dogs accidentally shooting their owners. Makes you wonder how many more of these so-called freak accidents happen because people aren't careful enough with their firearms.
It's a sobering thought for sure. These cases really highlight how important it is to be constantly aware and committed to safe gun practices. We can't just think, it won't happen to me. We have to acknowledge the very real danger of carelessness.
It's almost like there's a disconnect between knowing the rules and really understanding why they matter. We might know about gun safety guidelines, but do we really get how dangerous it can be if we don't follow them? This whole thing with Kirkwood and Oreo definitely brings that question to the forefront.
Definitely a question worth digging into. Why do people take those risks even when they know how bad it could be? What causes that disconnect between what we know and what we do?
I think that's a really good point. It's not just about reciting rules. It's about getting why those rules exist in the first place. And maybe by understanding that we can start to bridge that gap between what we know and how we act.
Exactly. And maybe that's one of the most important things we can take away from all of this. It's not just about this one crazy incident. It's about the bigger questions it raises about how we act, how we see risk, and how important it is to take responsibility for what we do. especially when it comes to things that can hurt people.
We've already covered a lot, right? From the incident itself to all the reactions on Reddit and the whole issue of gun safety. But we're not done yet. Stick with us because in part 2, we're going to dive into how the local news covered this story.
There's always more to the story. All right, so are we ready to switch gears a little bit and see how the local news handled this story? You know, sometimes local news can give you a different angle compared to like the big national stuff or even, the wild world of Reddit.
Yeah, it's like getting a peek into how the actual community is reacting to all of this, right? Like beyond the
Wow.
headlines and the online chatter, how are the people who are actually living there dealing with it?
Exactly. It makes it feel more real.
Totally. Okay, so the news segment we're looking at is from WREG News Channel 3 in Memphis. And it starts with the reporter Mike Sirianni standing on Whitney Avenue in Frazier, right, where it all happened.
Yeah, and he talks to a neighbor who wants to stay anonymous, which I totally get. I mean, who wouldn't if you suddenly live next door to the dog shoots owner house?
There.
Seriously. Talk about a crazy thing to have happen in your neighborhood. So this neighbor pretty much just repeats the stuff we already know. The couple's in bed, the dog jumps up the paw, gets caught in the trigger guard, and bam, gunshot.
And the report really makes it clear that the police only found one shell casing, which backs up the idea that it was just a single accidental shot.
Right, so it kind of solidifies the whole freak accident angle.
Mhm.
But here's where it gets interesting. The reporter then interviews a friend of Kirkwood's who says Oreo is a very friendly people dog.
Again, we're seeing that disconnect between, the stereotype of pit bulls as dangerous dogs and what this specific dog is actually like. It really makes you think, are we letting our own ideas about certain breeds cloud our judgment?
It's way too easy to just make assumptions based on like limited information or stereotypes.
Yeah.
This friend's description of Oreo really challenges those assumptions and reminds us that each dog, just like every person, is an individual. It's about recognizing that things aren't always so black and white. There's this tendency to just categorize and label everything, but reality is way more complicated than that.
Absolutely. And then the news segment throws in another interesting detail. The reporter mentions that they weren't allowed to take a picture of Oreo.
Now, why would that be? Maybe they're trying to keep the dog out of the spotlight or even just prevent any bad press considering what happened.
It's like they're trying to protect him from becoming like the poster dog for this whole bizarre incident, which honestly is probably for the best. Imagine those headlines. Trigger-happy pit bull on the loose.
Exactly. It's interesting how even in these local news reports, there's this sense of trying to be responsible, knowing how easily a story like this could turn into something sensational.
Right. And thankfully, the report also emphasizes that Kirkwood was discharged from the hospital, so his injuries weren't life-threatening. It's a good reminder that in the middle of all the shock and the speculation, the outcome could have been a lot worse.
It's like a little reality check, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this was a strange and potentially dangerous situation, but in the end, everyone is going to be okay.
Okay, so we've got this local news coverage that confirms the details of what happened, gives us a glimpse into how the community feels, and even tells us a bit about Oreo's personality. There's a nice contrast to the more opinionated and sometimes, heated discussions we saw on Reddit.
It reminds us that there's always more than one side to every story and that trying to understand those different perspectives can help us get a clearer picture of what's really going on.
It's like we're putting together a puzzle, right? Using pieces from international news online forums and local reports. It shows us that the truth often isn't found in just one place, but in how all those pieces fit together.
Right. It encourages people to think critically, to consider the biases in each source, and then come to their own conclusions based on a well-rounded view of the situation.
Now that we've looked at this incident from all these different angles, let's shift our focus to something that's at the heart of this whole conversation: risk assessment. Was this shooting really a freak accident, or was it something that could have been predicted, a result of choices and actions?
The age-old question of fate versus responsibility. We often use the term freak accident to describe things that seem totally random and out of the blue, but are they really?
It's like in this case, we've got a loaded firearm left on a bed in a house with a dog that's known to jump on furniture. Just looking at it objectively, there were definitely some risks there that maybe should have been considered.
For sure. And that's where this idea of risk perception comes into play. Humans are really bad at accurately assessing risk, especially when it's something that hasn't happened to us personally.
Yeah, that whole "it won't happen to me" mentality.
Yeah.
We tend to underestimate the chances of bad things happening, even when statistically they're not that unlikely.
It's a really interesting thing how our brains work. We're wired to focus on immediate rewards and downplay potential dangers, especially if those dangers feel far off or abstract.
It's kind of like that marshmallow experiment, right? where the kids who could wait and resist the temptation of getting a marshmallow right away ended up doing better in the long run.
Exactly. It's about understanding that our choices have long-term consequences and developing the self-control to act in ways that reduce potential risks, even if it means giving up something we want right now.
So how do we apply that to everyday life? How can we get better at evaluating risk and making choices that minimize harm, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us too?
That's a great question, and one that's worth exploring more. Because this incident, as strange as it is, can teach us something valuable about being aware of risks. It's about spotting potential dangers even in everyday situations and taking steps to prevent them.
It's like that saying hindsight is 20/20, right? It's always easier to look back after something bad happens and see what could have been done differently. But the real trick is to develop that foresight, that ability to see those dangers before they actually happen.
Exactly. It's about being proactive instead of reactive. And that's a skill that can be learned and used in so many different areas of life, from driving to raising kids to even managing money.
It's about making those conscious choices, even when they're not the easiest or most fun. And sometimes it's about challenging our own assumptions and biases, like we were talking about earlier, because those biases can sometimes keep us from seeing dangers that are right in front of us.
It's an ongoing process, learning, adapting, and refining how we see the world and the risks that come with it.
Well, we've covered a lot in this second part of our deep dive, from the local news coverage to a deeper look at risk perception and the psychology behind our decisions. But we're not finished just yet.
Stick around for our last segment where we'll bring everything together and leave you with some final food for thought.
All right, so welcome back, everyone. We've gone from this crazy news story in Tennessee to the wild world of Reddit, and even got a local perspective from the news. Now, as we wrap up this whole deep dive, let's take a step back and see what we've learned from this tale of a dog accidentally shooting its owner.
It's wild to me how something so random can make us think about so many things,
Yeah.
like human behavior, how society sees things, and even our own psychology.
It really shows how connected everything is, doesn't it? Okay, so big picture, what are some of the main takeaways from this whole thing?
Well, I think one thing is that it really drives home this point about responsible ownership. And I'm not just talking about pets. It applies to anything that could potentially hurt someone or something, right? Like a gun, a car, or even things we say and do online.
You're so right. It's about understanding that our choices have consequences, and sometimes those consequences can affect other people in ways we don't even think about.
Exactly. And like we saw with all the talk about pit bulls, it also reminds us that it's easy to jump to conclusions based on, just a little bit of information or our own biases.
It's so easy to have those knee-jerk reactions, especially these days with the news and social media always in our faces. But as we've seen, it's super important to take a step back, consider different perspectives, and even question our own assumptions if we want to really understand what's going on.
Totally. And it's not just about forming our own opinions, it's about making smarter choices. Like we
Yeah.
talked about, this whole incident really emphasizes how important it is to be proactive about safety, especially when it comes to guns.
That whole ounce of prevention thing, right?
Yeah,
It's so easy to think, it'll never happen to me. But this story is a huge reminder that accidents can and do happen. Sometimes they have really serious consequences.
it's about moving away from that I should have done this kind of thinking and towards a what can I do now to stop this from happening again kind of mindset.
It's about having that foresight, that awareness of potential dangers, even when things seem normal.
Mhm.
And it's about taking responsibility for what we do and how it could affect ourselves and the people around us.
You got it. It's about shifting from just going with the flow to being more aware and making conscious choices. And that can be really powerful, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
So before we officially wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. We've talked about biases, responsibility, and how we see risk, but I think there's another part of this story that's worth exploring: the role of narratives.
Ooh, I like where you're going with this. How do the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we hear shape how we see the world?
Exactly. Think about it. This whole incident on the surface is just a bizarre, almost funny story.
Mm.
But depending on how we look at it, it could become a warning about gun safety, a lesson about being a responsible pet owner, or even a starting point for talking about stereotypes about certain dog breeds.
It's crazy how the same facts can be turned into so many different stories, each with its own meaning and takeaways.
And that's a really important thing for all of us to remember. As we try to make sense of the world, it's crucial to pay attention to the stories we're hearing and the stories we're telling ourselves, and to ask ourselves, whose story is this? Who's getting to speak? Who's being heard? And who's being ignored?
Those are some great questions, because in the end, the stories we choose to believe shape not only how we see the world, but also how we act in it.
So as you go about your day, We encourage you to keep those questions in mind. Be critical about the information you come across. Don't just accept the easy stories. Seek out different perspectives. And always be open to questioning what you think you know.
It's a journey of learning and growing that never really ends. And as we've seen with this story, sometimes the most unexpected things can teach us the most valuable lessons.
Well said. All right, everyone, that's a wrap. From a dog shooting its owner to talking about responsibility biases and the power of stories, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
It's been a really interesting conversation, and we hope it's given you all something to think about.
We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the unexpected and the enlightening. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and as always, thanks for listening.